A great program today, so it is my pleasure to bring up Dr. Carol Probstfield, who is going to introduce our guest speaker.
Well, it's an honor to be here to introduce you to our guest speaker. He is one of my favorite faculty members. Professor Danny Firstman is a professor of political science and history at the State College of Florida, and he's been teaching since 2009. Danny received his BA in history from Rutgers University and an MA in political science from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. He's published and presented on the history of insurgent and third-party campaigns in American politics and on productivity in higher education. Since arriving at the State College of Florida, he started the college's award-winning Model UN team and program, and he serves on the board of directors for the Southern Region Model UN United Nations organization. And in addition to that, Danny has served in about every capacity you can imagine at the college in his young career. He has served as faculty senate president. Anything we ask him to do, he does, and he does it all so well. Every semester I have the opportunity to talk to students who are nominated for outstanding graduating student for that semester, and I ask them, what professor will you remember for the rest of your life? And every semester, Danny's name comes up. So not only is he my favorite teacher, he's also a favorite teacher of our students. Danny.
I hope we recorded the part where she said I was one of her favorite faculty. Okay. Oh, even better. Okay. Let's go with... Make sure that... Perfect. Okay. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for having me here today. As Carol can tell you, I often decline invitations to give public talks, because as a political science professor in 2017, my goal pretty much every morning, don't say anything that winds up going viral on social media. So hello, METV. So far, so good. We'll see how that goes today. I said yes because I have a soft spot in my heart for the Kiwanis Club. I grew up in Livingston, New Jersey, and the highlight of the calendar every year in Kiwanis was the Kiwanis Carnival in May. I actually have to admit that until sometime in my mid-20s, I thought the Kiwanis Club was a group of carnies and circus folk who traveled the country bringing joy to children throughout the land. So, my brother's reaction when I told him I was doing this talk was, wait, the carnival people? Which made me feel a little better. So I now know about all the great things that Kiwanis clubs do for our communities and our children, but there is a little part of me that is sad that the magical view I had of the world turned out not to be true. So we're going to talk today about politicization in higher education, and I'm really excited to be able to say the word politicization like 30 more times, rolls right off the tongue. And I'm going to start by just sharing with you what I have in mind when I say politicization, because it's not a word that necessarily has a common definition. I think it has to go beyond just the idea that there's an interaction between politics and higher education. Because in reality, that's been happening for at least 160 years, ever since the federal government first got into the higher education business. When I say politicization, I'm really thinking about a change in tone and a change in substance in the relationship between politicians and their appointed policymakers and the higher education system over the last 10 or 20 years. Now, what do I mean by change in tone? Well, if we were to pick a single word to represent this relationship between politicians, policymakers, and higher education for most of American history, I think the word that I would go with would be deference. Politicians and policymakers were willing to defer to higher education, for the most part, to set its own policies and its own rules. Because after all, higher education was one of the crown jewels of American civic institutions. It was the envy of higher education systems throughout the world, and other countries sent their best and their brightest to America to go to college. If we were to pick a word today, deference probably not one of the top 50 or 100. Maybe like skepticism over the ability of higher education to make its own policy. So that's the first piece of it. The second piece is a change in substance, and this is what I think most people have in mind when they talk about politicization. So as I said, there's always been some element of politics and higher education that have mixed. The budget, anytime there's state money involved, politics isn't far behind. That's always been there. Questions over creation of new institutions and what kinds of degrees they can offer. Individual politicians have always had idiosyncratic issues that they've really cared about in higher education. But I think in the last 10, 20 years, we've seen a change in the depth and the breadth of the kinds of issues that politicians really want to be involved in managing when it comes to higher education. And this is really, everything from labor and hiring practices to tenure policies to curriculum issues. So not just about should a college have a master's degree or a bachelor's degree, but what should those degrees be? What should the curricula of those degrees be? What should the courses and the curricula of those courses be? Even things like what should students be allowed to spend their speaker fees on? And I think the ultimate examples of this in the last legislative sessions, not Florida, so well done Florida, you're not making the list, North Carolina and Iowa had bills introduced that would have actually prohibited public institutions in the state from hiring employees with partisan identifications from certain parties until the balance on campus was closer to 50-50. Now, needless to say, these bills didn't go very far, but just the fact that they were introduced and taken at all seriously represents a pretty big change from what would have happened 50 or 60 years ago. And I'm going to mention 50 or 60 years ago quite a bit today, because this immediate post-World War II era is really when American higher education comes into its own. Before the war, it's very much an elite system. Only about 4% of Americans have a bachelor's degree. Then, between the GI Bill allowing returning veterans to get a degree and the Cold War creating an impetus for science and technology spending, we end up with the mass system that we have today where 30% have a bachelor's degree and even more have an associate's degree. So what has changed between then and now? Well, I'm going to talk to you today about 3 potential contributing causes: partisan polarization, economic stagnation, and the shifting cost burden from the taxpayer to the student. And we're going to start with partisan polarization because I like words that have a lot of syllables in them and get you a lot of points in Scrabble. So I realize these charts are a little difficult to see. The good news is that I'm going to describe most of them to you anyway, but not in a way that you're like, why is he just reading stuff on the PowerPoint? I hate when people do that. But what we're looking at here is this is a chart of the distribution of the ideologies of members of the United States House of Representatives. So if we look on the left, this chart is from 1952. And there's a couple things about the chart that sort of jump out at me really quickly. So we have liberal on the left, conservative on the right. The blue is Democrat, the red is Republican. So one thing that's really different from the world today is that the parties have a much wider distribution of ideologies within them than they have today. So Democrats span all the way from their liberal northern working class wing to their southern democratic wing. And then the Republicans, well, they have their fiscal conservative northern wing and they have their insurgent progressive midwestern western wing. And the other thing about the parties in 1952 that jumps out at me is that there's actually a decent amount of overlap in this moderate to right of center area here. Now, in the world of 1952, most issues are not going to be politicized, because in this kind of world, most issues are cross-cutting issues. They cut across the party divisions. And so it's actually really dangerous for politicians to raise them electorally, because you risk angering parts of your own base just as much as you might attract someone from the opposition base. When we look at the picture on the right, I probably didn't have to show you this picture. I think you could have imagined what it was going to look like. This is the United States House in 2014, and we see the familiar story of 2 warring teams. On the left, we have all of the liberals who have now become Democrats, and all of the conservatives who have now become Republican, and there are no moderates in the House of Representatives. In fact, last time I checked, I think there are 14 moderates left in the country, and 12 of them don't vote. So, in that world, there's a lot of issues that could potentially be politicized. Not all of them. There actually are still, it's hard to believe, but there are still some cross-cutting issues that the party coalitions have a hard time dealing with. But most issues, at least potentially, could be politicized. There are a couple features of higher education that lend themselves to politicization. I told you. So excited to say that over and over again. That lend themselves to being politicized. The first is that there is a group in society that has long been suspicious of higher education, and that's social conservatives. And when I say long, I'm talking like Galileo in the church, which I think is probably, unless you're going to give me a few hours here, is probably beyond the confines of the talk that we're going to have. But you can think of something even as recently as the protest movements on college campuses in the 60s and 70s. It would be perfectly reasonable for a social conservative watching the news for 15 years at home to wonder if college campuses weren't just a place for turning out liberal hippies. But in the 60s, there wasn't really a place in the political system for those kinds of concerns, partially because social conservatives hadn't been mobilized as a force yet. Those issues hadn't been politicized themselves, but also because social conservatives didn't have a party home. We were still in this world where they were split between the two parties. Today, they very much do have a home within the Republican Party, and they're an important part of the Republican base. This means that Republican Party politicians have a very strong incentive to respond to these suspicions. There's also been a change in the party demographics in terms of education. So it used to be the case that Republicans had a small advantage among those with a college degree, whereas Democrats were the party of the working class with high school degrees. That has basically flipped. Today, Democrats have a small lead among those with college degrees and a much larger lead among those with a postgraduate degree, whereas Republicans are now the party of those with a high school degree or some college education. So this creates some potential here. We have two parties sharply divided on a number of issues that have different levels of exposure and experience with higher education, and one of them that has a group that is a little suspicious of the entire enterprise. I don't want you to think I'm making this up. This is actually, I checked beforehand, this is the hardest slide for those of you in the back to see, so I will walk you through it. This is actually just survey data. So what we're looking at here is the Pew Research Center. Every year, they ask a representative sample of Americans, what do you think about the media, which must be fascinating, those numbers are great, like 0%. The media, the military, business, colleges and universities, do you think they're contributing positively or negatively to the direction of the country? And then we can break that data down in all sorts of ways: gender, race, ethnicity, education, or, for example, party identification. So if we look at the 2017 data, well, among Democrats, 72% say that colleges and universities contribute positively to the direction of the country. Among Republicans, 36%. 72%, 36%. I've looked at a lot of public opinion data in my life. About the only time you see those kinds of numbers is when you are asking about someone, like a person who is clearly identified with a party. You ask about Donald Trump, Barack Obama, you see numbers like this. You ask about a faceless, massive institution like colleges and universities, of which there are thousands, this is really rare and kind of surprising. And the data will show you that it's not like a new thing. 2010, there's a 7 percentage point gap, which means that this didn't just happen yesterday. But it's also not an incredibly old thing either, because they've been doing this survey since the 60s, and they didn't even think to ask about this until the 2000s, because there was no conception in the 80s or 90s that people might have partisan differences on, oh, there we go. Computer's restarting, so you're not getting slides for the rest of this. We're just going to have to hope that I remember it. Which is good. This is an ultimate appeal to authority. I have data, but you're going to have to believe me that it's not fake data. Yes, this is great. I always tell my students, don't believe me just because I say it, but you have to believe me. So, they didn't even think to ask about these questions, right? There was no consideration of that. Now, before we move on to the second cause, I do want to be clear. I'm not saying that Republicans are anti-higher education and Democrats are pro-higher education. For my money, the absolute most mind-blowing innovation in the world of higher education policy in the last 10 years is the free community college movement, which started in Tennessee by a Republican governor, and they're actually the only state that I think has gotten it right so far. And if you dig into the data on public opinion by party, you actually find out that both parties are suspicious of higher education, just in different ways, and they have different concerns. They do have different views about the system as a whole and whether it's positive or negative, as we just saw. And you definitely have the parties pushing the system in different ways, so the politicization is happening from both ends. But the suspicions definitely are louder from one side of the spectrum than the other. But even with this is not by itself a sufficient cause for politicization. Because we could imagine a world in which higher education was still seen as the engine of economic growth. And if that was the case, then even if both parties were suspicious of colleges and universities, politicians wouldn't be able to get any traction with getting control over it, because people would be like, yeah, we're suspicious of it, but it's still doing a good job, so leave it alone. Which leads us to our second cause, economic stagnation. And both the good news for me as the presenter and the bad news for all of us as people living in America is I don't need a slide for economic stagnation, because we've all kind of lived that for the last 30 years. We used to have 10% year-over-year GDP growth, no problem. These days in developed democracies, we're lucky if we get 2 to 3%, that's a good year. And that 2 to 3% that we do get has overwhelmingly in the last decade or two gone to the top 1, 2, 3% of earners in society. This is a double whammy for higher education. Because on the one hand, as I mentioned earlier, the supply of people getting degrees, well, that's going up. And on the other hand, the demand in the form of good middle-class jobs, well, that's declining. This is a mismatch. It's a mismatch that's a problem for colleges in terms of their graduates. It's a mismatch that's a problem for society in terms of people getting jobs. And it's a mismatch for the perception of colleges. It used to be that college was like a train ticket to the middle class. You buy your ticket, you get on the train, you ride it for 4 years, you have a good time on the train, you try not to get kicked off the train, and then eventually you get to your destination, you get your degree, you get your middle class job. And now it's still a ticket, but it's a lottery ticket. You buy it and you hope. And the third cause is the fact that that lottery ticket is now a lot more expensive than it used to be. This is the shifting cost burden from the taxpayer to the student, or as it's sometimes known, the affordability crisis. So tuition has gone up much faster than the wage of the median household, which has basically been flat since the 70s. I'm almost kind of glad you can't see that chart, because that chart's the most depressing of them all. Right? It's even gone up faster than the median income of the top 1% we hear so much about. It's gone up faster than inflation. It's gone up faster than anything you could graph against time other than healthcare costs. So thank you, healthcare, for making education look better. And like household prices, if you buy a house in New York or San Francisco, that's still more expensive than higher education. So that's it. Everything else, tuition, going up faster than that. Now, a little bit of this is sort of like a public relations crisis, because the return on investment to a degree is actually still the same as it was in the 70s, which means that even though the cost is going up, the amount of extra money as a percentage of that cost that you could expect to earn over your lifetime has stayed pretty steady. But it turns out that this isn't because people with associate's and bachelor's degrees are earning so much more than they used to. They're earning a bit more adjusting for inflation, but mostly it's because people who don't have those degrees are earning so much less than they used to. And if your slogan is come to college or else, I mean, I don't do marketing, but I'm just guessing that's not going to go down very well with the public. So people like to ask me at this point, Danny, why has tuition gone up so much? And I will level with you, this is a very controversial area of the policy world, and the answer that you find most compelling has a lot to do with where you fall on the ideological spectrum, which gets us right back to that first cause. But the mainstream position for public colleges and universities is that there are numerous causes, as there always are in the policy world, but the biggest driver has to do with state disinvestment, that states have been cutting their funding to higher education. And this isn't a surprise to anyone in this room, I would suspect, and it's a pretty logical way that it happens. A recession hits, states are required to balance their budgets by law. They're not going to raise taxes, so you can forget about that. So cutting spending, that seems to be the thing that happens. And higher education makes for a pretty tempting target relative to, for example, cutting spending on K-12 or cutting spending on Medicaid for the poor and senior citizens. Higher education makes for a logical choice. And you could have a world in which you cut spending at the beginning of a recession and then you start to return it as the recession ends. You add a little extra funding during the good years to make up for it, and it's not ideal, but you could live in that world. That's not been the world we've had in the recessions since the 80s. What we've had is you've cut spending during recessions and then you've made up some of it during the good times, but you've never actually got back to the level you started at. What I particularly like to show, and this is the only slide that I'm actually sorry you won't get to see, is that there is a map of the United States which shows every single state and their funding today relative to 2008 and what the state was giving their public higher education system in 2008. And what I like about it is that it shows you that every single state, other than the two that managed to luck into a fracking boom and got lots of natural resource money, has not in a single year from 2008 to today given as much money as they gave in 2008. So that's 47 states, 9 years, not a single one. And what I like about that is it shows you it's not red states, it's not blue states, it's every state. And so what this does is this allows for the possibility of politicians and policymakers to say, look, you're not doing a good job, you're raising tuition, you don't seem to be delivering jobs, there's an opportunity here for us, or even a concern, right? Constituents are worried, people are worried that you're not doing your job. Add that in with what's already a partisan polarized world, and we have the conditions for politicization. So if the question becomes, where is this going in the future? Well, the politicization cat, I think, is out of the bag. And I don't think that one's going back in. But I do think there are a couple conversations that will be had in this country. One, as a country as a whole, I think we're long overdue for a conversation about what kind of higher education system we want to have. There are countries where higher education is purely a private affair, where it's seen as a private benefit and the student pays the full cost of tuition. And that's a perfectly logical and valid system. And then there are countries where it's fully a public affair, and there's no tuition, people pay for it in the form of taxes. That works too. America, as we so often do, kind of has a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and then we want the benefits of both systems, but mostly we just complain about the drawbacks of both of them. But I also think colleges and universities need to have a conversation and figure out why they're failing to speak to a decent portion of the population, and why, for example, there's 36% of the public that, only 36% of half the country thinks that they're contributing positively to the direction of the country. So I think there's a lot of introspection that's required from sort of everyone to figure out how to exist in this new politicized world that we're living in. So what I would show you at this point, instead, I'll just tell you I'll just hang around afterwards. I know we have some time for questions, but in the event that we don't get to your question, I will hang out afterwards so I can either answer it or I can give you my email address if you prefer to do it that way, and you're always welcome to email me. But if you don't want to wait for that, my email address at the college is fuerstd@scf.edu. Hello, actually, it might have actually worked out well for me because my last slide had my personal email address, and I'm not entirely sure in retrospect that I wanted that on METV. So this may have worked out well. So thank you all, and if we have time for questions, I'm happy to take them. Ooh. Yeah, so there was a question about, I kind of feel like I want to kick this to the people sitting at the table there, but there's been a question about like massive growth in endowments at colleges and what they're doing with that money. And I think what I like about this question as the first question is that it highlights that when a lot of people think about colleges, what they're really thinking about is like 100 or 150 colleges in America, so like Harvard. Harvard's sitting on more money than like the Church of England. It's unbelievable. And I don't know what Harvard's doing with their money. They're not giving it to me. But there are like this small number of select schools that have very large endowments, and they're either like private schools whose graduates have, run hedge funds that make billions, or they're public schools whose graduates love their football teams and give them, and I tell you what they're spending it on, and it's the football team. Most colleges in America, like 2,900 of them, do not have particularly large endowments. So like, I'm going to just off the cuff here guess it's 40% of the colleges in America are community colleges. And even having a foundation with an endowment is a relatively unique thing in the community college world still. So I think that there are places that do have a pretty hefty endowment that they could stand to spend down. Like, for example, I would guess Harvard's interest on their endowment is larger than many of the college budgets in Florida. But I think most institutions would envy being in that position and would be happy to, this is a good pitch. Feel free to give to your alma maters if you haven't in a while, and they'd be delighted to be in that position. Yeah, so the question was what do you think colleges and universities can do to change their perception? It is very troubling to see those kinds of public opinion numbers. So Gallup did a follow-up survey where they looked at the people who said that they thought, from both parties, they thought college was having a negative impact on the country. And then they asked them free-form answer, why? And then they coded those answers. And what they found was among Democrats who thought college wasn't helping the country, it was because of affordability. They thought it wasn't affordable. And among Republicans, it was because of the political climate on campus. So I think the way you deal with those are probably different. So the affordability thing is absolutely a real thing, but I think that sort of gets back to the first answer, and it's a public relations thing about really making people realize that there are affordable options. The state of Florida has done a great job of having many affordable options, both in the 2-year and the 4-year system. When we hear about students graduating with massive amounts of student loan debt, it's usually not because they started at their local 2-year college and then transferred to the local 4-year college. It's because, they went to a school that was well beyond the price that they could afford, that wasn't necessarily delivering them any sort of better education. It's just they made a choice. I'm not going to knock them. I started out at one of those schools, and at 18, we all make lots of choices. That was probably the least bad choice I made that year. So, but I think the heart of your question is what do we do for those Republican respondents who are worried about the ideology question? And I think for them, some of that is, again, just getting people to recognize, like, there are hundreds and hundreds of Bible colleges in this country. And when people are asked that question, they don't think about that as being part of higher education. That's an unsatisfying answer. What we really want to know is, what do we do about the 100 or 200 or 300 colleges that are visible and that people think of when they watch the news and they see what's going on? And I think it's incumbent on those institutions to really reflect on the fact that you can't necessarily, even if your student body leans one direction or the other, you can't ignore the fact that half the country identifies with a political ideology. I mean, I don't think we're going to a world anytime soon where we're all going to suddenly decide that we like each other again and, we're going to have kumbaya. So I think it's about figuring out a way to say, okay, how can we make everyone feel like they are welcome on campus? How can we make everyone feel like, yes, they are? And some of that you just can't do. Colleges have been accused for decades upon decades of, turning students into liberal hippies. Some of that you just can't win. There is lots of evidence that shows that, yes, students do become more liberal at college, rarely because professors tell them to. If I tell my students to do their homework, they don't do that. I can't imagine telling them what to think politically. But I think that we just need to have that conversation, and institutions, such as SCF, USF, the local institutions that are really tied into their communities need to do a better job getting people thinking of that as college and university too. A bit of it's kind of like when you ask people about Congress and they say, I hate Congress, but I like my congressman. Right? That happens all the time in polls. And I would suspect that if you ask people, like, what do you think about colleges and universities? Boo. What do you think about USF, SCF? Yay. Right? So some of it is just that, what they're hearing in the news about colleges. But I do think there needs to be more outreach there. Increasingly, it might have to be going on to those media sites where people are finding that stuff. Because in our social media world, the only way you can reach people now are the sites that they follow and the TV channels that they watch and the stuff that they go to. So not an easy answer, and I'm not sure that I necessarily have them, but they're just possibilities that are out there. I think it varies tremendously by institution. So like at a school like Maricopa Community College in Arizona, which is either the second or third largest community college district in the country, somewhere during the recession, Arizona cut all of their funding to the district. They just said, we're done with you. Which I am sure was a political decision involved in that. And then I don't know Arizona politics, but you don't completely cut state. So at this point, student funding has gone up tremendously there. In Florida, where the governor has made it very clear that there will not be tuition increases regardless, student contribution has really not risen a whole lot. We've just, cut and cut and cut and cut because that's what, there's only so many things you can do when your revenue isn't going up. So I think it depends a bit on the institution, but there is, I think, no doubt that since 2008, across the country, the portion the student has paid, even at, the most fortunate of even schools, not North Dakota and Wyoming, so if anyone finds any shale gas in Florida, please let me know. But the rest of the states, I think that portion has definitely increased pretty substantially. I wish I had specific numbers to give you, and I'm happy to look them up and get them to you after the talk. I just don't want to give you something off the top of my head and then turn out to be wildly wrong. Thank you. Thank you. I'm very good at that.
And it is, as you know, a tradition at the Bradenton Kiwanis Club to give our speaker the Kiwanis Golden Rule. Professor, thank you so much for speaking with us. We greatly appreciate it. It was fascinating, wasn't it?
It took me 20 years, but I finally got something from the Kiwanis Carnival. Thank you very much.
And with that, we are adjourned.